Hello, and welcome back to my humble show. I am your host for today and every other day, the Articulate Thinker. Hopefully, here to bring you art articles and articulation straight from Articulation Station, so be sure to like, subscribe, and enjoy the ride. Don't forget to turn on those bell notifications while you're at it. I'm going to be talking about the Taliban, or as some would say, the Taliban. Alright, so I saw this article just recently, had it saved for a later day, and today is that later day because yesterday was the 2-year anniversary since the fall of Kabul. So I uploaded a rhyme onto my Articulate Thinker Monologues channel bright and early this morning. I might play it at the end of this show. If not, I'm just letting you know you can go over to my other channel. That's Articulate Thinker Monologues, and you can find it there. But for now, yes, because yesterday was the 2-year anniversary since that fall, as in, disaster, not time of the year. And also because some of the Gold Star family members testified in front of a congressional forum less than 2 weeks ago, I believe. I wanted to talk about this. So here is that article that I saw recently. Yeah, here you go. From the Washington Free Beacon, Biden administration has given $2.35 billion to Taliban-controlled Afghanistan. So who exactly is receiving this money? We're not sure. Similar to Ukraine, we're just not sure whose hands exactly the money is ending up in, but we are sending billions upon billions of dollars. And in this case, this is not to mention the amount of weaponry which we left them, whether at Bagram Air Base, which was basically a stockpile left for them to take over, or, whatever forms and fashions it was left to them in. I'm not saying it was necessarily intentional, like a Christmas gift or anything like that. But bad intel or not, when the government fled, we left our weaponry instead, our military weaponry instead, in the hands of the Taliban. So that was no good. There's a bit of speculation over the worth of all of that weaponry, whether it was 80 million or I don't know. You tell me. Let me know in the comments below what you think, what you know. I'm no expert on all of this, on foreign policy, on anything really. But silly me, I just have some thoughts and I want to think out loud for a few minutes. Yes. As for the rest of this article, the Biden administration has provided more than $2.35 billion in taxpayer dollars to Afghanistan since the Taliban retook control of the government in 2021 following a deadly U.S. evacuation. And that's what my rhyme was about. The botched withdrawal from Afghanistan and the blame which should have gone to the Bidens. Though Mr. The Buck Stops With Me did not take any of that blame or shame. So shame on him. Shame on them. Him and his administration. But yes, here we are 2 years later. And again, where exactly has all of this money gone? Well, people over there need it, obviously, but it kind of has to be filtered through the hands of the Taliban. So, yeah, humanitarian effort. I don't want to say it's a bad idea, necessarily. It's just not reliable. The United States remains Afghanistan's top patron, even as lawmakers and federal oversight officials warn that these funds could be propping up the Taliban's terrorist government. There you go. A little easier to read now if you're reading it off the screen. Either way, I'll read it for you. Updated spending figures were disclosed Tuesday in a report by the Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction, SIGAR, a federal watchdog that documents waste, fraud, and abuse related to U.S. expenditures in the war-torn country. I actually have that pulled up. I believe right here. Yeah, SIGAR, Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, July 30 of this year. Quarterly report to the United States Congress. This is a lengthy document, over 200 pages long. I just wanted to let you know. So if you want to get your hands on this, I can link it to you. There's a lot here. I'm not even going to begin to scroll to the bottom. You get the point. You get the picture. Back to this article from Washington Free Beacon. Around 1.7 billion remain available for possible disbursement at the time of Cigar's report, meaning that this money is ready to be flown into nonprofit groups and other entities working on reconstruction projects in Afghanistan. With the Taliban exerting control over nearly every sector of the country's infrastructure, including the NGO community, it is more than likely that a sizable portion of these funds will end up in the terror group's coffers, funding them even more fully than they have already been funded. The latest figures are certain to increase congressional pressure on the Biden administration to stop sending taxpayer funds into Afghanistan until officials can ensure the Taliban is not stealing the money. John Sopko, head of SIGAR, told the House Foreign Affairs Committee in April that he cannot assure this committee or the American taxpayer we are not currently funding the Taliban. Sopko also accused the Biden administration of blocking his investigatory efforts and refusing to hand over documents that could show if the Taliban is being propped up by American cash. And it could be that the Biden administration is blocking his investigatory efforts because they want to keep controlling the narrative, since it was so successful of a withdrawal, except for the fact that it wasn't. I mean, we're out. We're out, at least most of us. 13 fallen soldiers are not. And when I say fallen in this case, I mean they died at the hands of a terrorist who I believe was straight out of Bagram Air Base, in the prison there. Correct me if I'm wrong on that. Yeah, because that plan didn't pan out. Wasn't much of a plan, though. The United States Institute of Peace recently warned that the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, the primary vehicle for U.S. spending in Afghanistan, that the Taliban is pushing for ever-increasing decrees of credit and control over the delivery of aid. United Nations officials also disclosed to the watchdog that the Taliban have effectively infiltrated and influenced most UN-managed assistance programming. All right, what else do we have here? This reality is raising questions about the nearly $2 billion in funds the Biden administration has made available for disbursement in the country. Wait a second. Before I move on any further, let me just read this one more time. This reality is raising questions about the nearly $2 billion in funds. So nearly $2 billion in funds. But up here, this article says the Biden administration has given already $2.35 billion. Okay, so we've given $2.35 billion already, and there is nearly $2 billion more in funds the Biden administration has made available for disbursement. So it could be doubled up ultimately, but it has not been dispersed yet, to my understanding, according to what I'm reading, if I'm reading it correctly. As U.S. aid money flows to the country, Taliban interference and NGO work escalated, leading to a disbursement. Oh, wait a second. I read the same line again. Leading to a steady decline in humanitarian access in 2023, with a 32% increase in incidents between January and May 2023 as compared to the same period in 2022, according to the report. Sorry, it's harder for me to read when it's full screen like this. The Taliban is comfortable accepting foreign support insofar as they can closely monitor the organizations, including restricting and controlling them, and claim some credit for the provision of the benefits, Cigar reported. USAID told the watchdog group that Taliban interference in humanitarian assistance is the main barrier to beneficiaries accessing aid in 2023. The Taliban government also has not moderated its jihad principles since seizing the country. Well, of course not. Their reign of terror and tyranny no longer has any limitations since we are not there. Despite Taliban promises made since gaining power in August 2021 to be more inclusive, as though they're about that life, counterterrorism, respect human rights, and do not pose a security threat to the region, the UN says that the Taliban shows no signs of bending to pressure for reform and compromise. According to the report, as Cigar and congressional oversight committees raise concerns about the Biden administration's push to pump money into Afghanistan, the government agencies in control of these expenditures are not cooperating with investigations. SOPCO revealed in April that the Department of State, USAID, the UN, and other agencies are refusing to give us basic information that we or any oversight body would need to ensure safe stewardship of tax dollars. More troubling, he added, State and USAID have instructed their employees not to talk to Cigar, and in one recent instance, State told one of its contractors not to participate in a Cigar audit. The White House also would not cooperate with Cigar. Congress has had similar experiences, with USAID declining to tell investigators what safeguards were put in place to ensure taxpayer cash is not stolen by the Taliban. I'm not personally all that familiar with Cigar, however they want you to pronounce that, since, I'm not an expert on foreign policy, but again, you can find the documents, you can find the receipts, at least what they were able to come up with in their report here, quarterly report to the United States Congress. See it for yourself. But here is what else I have to read. The flip side of all of this. When we hear about the potential misgiving of our money, our taxpayer dollars, we might think, forget the humanitarian effort. More fiscal responsibility, right? But on that flip side, there's this. Afghan Taliban celebrate return to power 2 years on amid erosion of women's rights. So human rights abuses, which they are not a stranger to. Yeah, this sort of thing happens as well as droughts and that sort of thing. A lot of suffering over there. They don't have as much as we do. And though if we give to them, it may not actually go to who we want it to go to. When we don't give, does the suffering increase even more? Well, you tell me. That's a balance I'm not sure how we should strike. But let me read right through this article from Reuters. Quick, fast, and in a hurry. I have another one slightly more detailed to read if I proceed to read this one fast enough. Afghanistan's Taliban marked the second anniversary of the return to power on Tuesday, celebrating their takeover of Kabul and the establishment of what they said was security throughout the country under an Islamic system. After a lightning offensive as U.S.-led foreign forces were withdrawing after 20 years of inconclusive war, the Taliban entered the capital on August 15 of 2021 as the Afghan security forces, set up with years of Western support, disintegrated, and U.S.-backed President Ashraf Ghani fled. Yeah, he fled. And instead, Taliban took over. Because our intel was, well, apparently wrong. Though the Biden administration is like, oh, we didn't know this, we didn't know that because the intel was bad. Also, it wasn't a failure. It was a success. It was a success. Yeah, it was a success. It was all a success. What about the 13 soldiers who died? You don't hear their names. Well, you'll hear them from me, and I will also read their names at the end of this show if I have time to do so. Yeah. On the second anniversary of the conquest of Kabul, we would like to congratulate the Mujahid, Holy Warrior Nation, and I probably mispronounced that as well, but the nation of Afghanistan, and ask them to thank Almighty Allah for this great victory. Taliban spokesman Zabihullah Mujahid said in a statement, Afghanistan is enjoying peace not seen in decades, but the UN says there have been dozens of attacks on civilians, some claimed by Islamic State rivals of the Taliban, because the Taliban, not always tight with ISIS types, not always, but sometimes, when it's convenient for them, I guess. And yeah, even if there is peace, that doesn't mean there's prosperity. There's not always prosperity with peace. Doesn't mean there's not human rights abuses. For many women who enjoyed extensive rights and freedoms during the 2 decades of rule by Western-backed governments, their plight has become dire since the return of the Taliban. It's been 2 years since the Taliban took over in Afghanistan. 2 years that upturned the lives of Afghan women and girls, their rights and futures. Amina Mohammed, Deputy Secretary General of the UN, said in a statement, security was tight in the capital on Tuesday, which was declared a holiday. Taliban fighters, supporters, and some Kabul residents gathered on streets and vehicles, drove slowly in informal parades carrying soldiers and children waving black and white flags. Today I've come here to see the commemoration of the second anniversary of the Taliban. It was the day of the economy, or I want to say economy every time I see the word enemy. It was the day that the enemy of Afghanistan was expelled from our country. That's why I came here to celebrate, said resident Saeed Hashmatullah Sadat. So they believe that we were expelled. I mean, we kind of withdrew, right? Not in a very formal fashion. Speaking of informal, we pulled out the weapons before we pulled out the people. Well, wait a second. We didn't pull out the weapons. We pulled out the people who could use the weapons, left the weapons, and then pulled out the people, the citizens, the average citizens, who were left to the mercy of the Taliban, whether they were falling from wheel wells as the planes began to take off, or, whether they survived the blast of the terrorist attack and the suicide bombing that took place not too long after. Remember Joe Biden saying, we will hunt you down and kill you, in his Liam Neeson speech? Of course. We're now to believe that the attacker, the suicide bomber, was obviously killed in the attack, which doesn't really explain why Joe Biden and his generals felt the need to blow up an innocent family of Afghans after that, claiming that then they had caught the attackers. It's like, wait a second. Maybe they meant they caught those responsible for the attackers, for the attack, for the suicide bomber. Well, I guess not. Because it's not like they followed up on that inaccurate strike with an accurate strike. So here we are. Still no accountability taken by the Biden administration. Now that overall security is ensured in the country, the entire territory of the country is managed under a single leadership. An Islamic system is in place, and everything is explained from the angle of Sharia. Mujahid, the spokesman, said, in a Kabul tailoring workshop, 27-year-old Miriam, who set up the business after losing a job first in the international project, then as a teacher, she said she dreaded the anniversary. I don't blame her. They may be celebrating, but the women don't have much to celebrate now, do they? I might use this as a thumbnail. Let me see. There we go. Thumbnail. Obstacle to recognition. Girls over the age of 12 have been mostly excluded from classes since the Taliban returned to power. For many Western governments, the ban is a major obstacle to any hope of formal recognition of the Taliban administration. The Taliban, who say they respect rights in line with their interpretation of Islamic law, have also stopped most Afghan female staff from working at aid agencies, closed beauty salons, barred women from parks, and curtailed travel for women in the absence of a male guardian. Sometimes a male guardian can be good in order to protect the women, but I don't think that's what this is all about. Journalism, which also blossomed in the 2 decades of the rule by Western-backed governments, has been significantly suppressed. The detention of media workers and civil society activists, including prominent education advocate Matula Wesa, has raised the alarm of human rights groups. The Taliban have not commented in detail on those issues, but say their law enforcement and intelligence agencies investigate activities they consider suspicious to seek explanations. On a positive side, the corruption that exploded as Western money poured in for years after the Taliban were ousted in 2001 has been reduced, according to the UN Special Representative. Really? That's the positive side. If true. That would be surprising if true. But we're not really over there to keep an eye on things as much anymore, so I don't know that I buy that. There are also signs that the Taliban a Taliban ban, that's a tongue twister, a Taliban ban on narcotics cultivation has dramatically reduced poppy production in what has for years been the world's biggest source of opium. The Taliban will be hoping the progress will help bring foreign recognition and the lifting of sanctions and the release of about $7 billion in central bank assets froze in the U.S. Federal Reserve Bank of New York in 2021, half of which was later transferred to a Swiss trust. Seems like an interesting rabbit hole to go down. A fall off in development of aid has seen job opportunities shrink, and the UN estimates more than 2/3 of the population need humanitarian aid to survive. Okay. So that is that. This is this article from the Associated Press. I don't have time to read through all of this. I have to go back to work like 5 minutes ago. How do I want to play this? Do I want to save this for later? Pause this show, record it when I get back from work. There's a lot here, so yeah, I think I'll leave this pulled up. Just pause my recording and finish it off later, because I want to be as thorough as possible. Alright, I'll be back. Back like I never left. Alright, I'm back in action. See, what had happened was, I'll try to pick up right where I left off. Hopefully I don't repeat myself on anything. It has been several hours. Yeah, several hours of work, so I'm going to speed read most of this because much of this was reported on in the previous article, I imagine. And if you get tired of hearing me read, well, just know that this is an opportunity for me to both read and research and record. I said both, but that's 3 things. Yeah, research and record simultaneously, so that's what this is all about. I enjoy learning about things on the fly sometimes because time flies, and yeah, I do what I can. All right, so from the AP, Associated Press here. The Taliban are entrenched in Afghanistan after 2 years of rule. Women and girls pay the price. And so do we, since we are still funding them. I'm not sure exactly who they are, but, you know, I've already discussed that a bit. The Taliban have settled in as rulers of Afghanistan 2 years after they seized power as U.S. and NATO forces withdrew from the country following 2 decades of war. The Taliban face no significant opposition that could topple them. They have avoided international divisions by falling in line behind their ideologically unbending leader. They have kept a struggling economy afloat, in part by holding investment talks with the capital-rich region or regional countries, even as the international community withholds formal recognition. That's what they would like, but they are not going to comply socioeconomically to the point where we will recognize them as a legitimate government. Although I wouldn't put it past us, honestly. Either way, there's a lot going on behind the scenes over there that we don't really get much of a peek into. They have improved domestic security through crackdowns on armed groups such as the Islamic State, and say they are fighting corruption and opium production. I mean, it could be that they just don't want any competition, so they go after the sedition of Islamic State groups. Other than that, I just don't know that they're all that opposed to radicalism. But it's their slew of bans on Afghan girls and women that dominated the Taliban's second year in charge. They barred them from parks, gyms, universities, and jobs at non-governmental groups and the United Nations, all in the space of a few months, allegedly because they weren't wearing a proper hijab, the Islamic head covering, or violated gender segregation rules, something we no longer deal with in this country. But hey, they are not quite as innovative as we are. These orders followed a previous ban issued in the first year of the Taliban rule on girls going to school beyond 6th grade. Here is a closer look at Taliban rule and where they are headed. So we have people like Kamala Harris within our government acting like it's the end of the world because of some kind of book banning happening down in Florida, which isn't really happening, not in the way she says. And also, we have things like this happening on the other side of the world. Yeah, much bigger fish to fry over there than we have over here, apparently. Which is a good thing for us. But it's not as bad as we make it out to be sometimes over here. And when I say we, I mean she. We kind of have it made. We kind of have the spoils. Why did they exclude women from higher education, most jobs, and public spaces? The Taliban say they are committed to implementing their interpretation of Islamic law, or Sharia, in Afghanistan. Hold on. I think my wife is in the other room talking. I'm going to make sure she's not trying to talk to me. Unpause. Okay, here we go. Where was I? Lost my place here. This leaves no space for anything they think is foreign or secular, such as women working or studying. It's what drove them in the late 1990s when they first seized power in Afghanistan, and it propels them now ever since they took control again on August 15 of 2021. Turn my music back on. I don't know if you can even hear it, but it keeps me calm. Some background music. Their supreme leader, Hibatullah Akhundzada, has praised the changes imposed since their takeover, claiming life improved for Afghan women after foreign troops left and the hijab became mandatory again. I don't know much about this person. I don't remember if he is someone who was formerly imprisoned in Afghanistan. I'm not sure. I know that they had some leaders who were let out by the Taliban who were taking over at the time, and they took their places in their new so-called government. But I'm not sure who is who. I can't say their names anyways. What was the response to these bans? Foreign governments, rights groups, global bodies condemned the restrictions. UN said they were a major obstacle to the Taliban gaining international recognition as a legitimate government of Afghanistan. Overseas aid is drying up as major donors stop their funding, pulled in different directions by other crises. and worried their money might fall into Taliban hands. The lack of funds, as well as the exclusion of Afghan women from delivering essential humanitarian services, is hitting the population hard, pushing more people into poverty. What are living conditions like in Afghanistan? Nearly 80% of the previous Western-backed Afghan government's budget came from the international community. That money, now largely cut off, financed hospitals, schools, factories, and government ministries. The COVID-19 pandemic, medical shortages, climate change, and malnutrition have made life more desperate for Afghans. Aid agencies have stepped into the breach to provide basic services like health care. Afghanistan is struggling with its third consecutive year of drought-like conditions, the ongoing collapse in families' income, and restrictions on international banking. It's also still suffering that is, from decades of war and natural disasters. And just so you know, when I get to the end of this, I will play the clip of my rhyme, which I mentioned earlier. And then after that, I'll go through the names of the fallen 13 soldiers, of course, who gave their lives during the botched withdrawal. I'm not going to focus on the details of why it was botched, not in this show. I mostly want to cover what is happening there now, which is what I've been reading about. But for another time, I may have some more ranting to do, because I could do quite a bit of ranting, honestly. Excuse me. How likely are the Taliban to change direction? Well, let's see here. I think I might have skipped a section. Yeah, I did. How is the economy doing? I'll read that first. The World Bank said last month that the local currency, the Afghani, gained value against major currencies. Customers can withdraw more money from individual deposits made before August 2021, and most civil servants are being paid. The World Bank described revenue collection as healthy and said most basic items remained available, although demand is low. The Taliban have held investment talks with countries in the region, including China and Kazakhstan. They want sanctions removed and billions of dollars in frozen funds to be released, saying these measures will alleviate the suffering of Afghans. But the international community will only take such steps once the Taliban take certain actions, including lifting restrictions on women and girls. I believe the Bidens have received money from both China and Kazakhstan, if I'm not mistaken. Not saying that's tied to this in any way. It's just that, there's more potential for leverage against us when money is changing hands in such a way as we have much reason to believe at this point, whether it's via Hunter Biden or Joe Biden himself. Anyways, how likely are the Taliban to change direction? It's largely up to the Taliban leader, Akhundzada. This cleric counts like-minded government ministers and Islamic scholars among his circle. He is behind the decrees on women and girls. His edicts, framed in the language of Islamic law, are absolute. There's a link to a further explanation of that, but I'll move on. The bans will only be lifted if Akhundzada orders it. Some Taliban figures have spoken out against the way decisions are made, and there has been a disagreement among the bans on women and girls. But the Taliban chief spokesman, Zabihullah Mujahid, slammed these reports as propaganda. Already read that earlier. Sorry for the repetition. The secret of their success is that they are united. Abdul Salam Zaif, who served as the Taliban envoy to Pakistan when they ruled Afghanistan in the 1990s, said, "If someone expresses his opinion or his thoughts, it doesn't mean someone is against the leadership or will go to another side," said Zaif, who spent several years at the Guantanamo Bay Detention Center after the 2001 U.S. invasion. Disagreements are put in front of the emir, who is Akhundzada, and he decides. They follow his word. In other words, they do not have a democracy or a republic over there. Not at all. What about international recognition? Aid officials say the Taliban view recognition as an entitlement, not something to be negotiated. The officials also cite high-level meetings with powerful states like China and Russia as signs that the Taliban are building bilateral relations in their own way. Qatar's prime minister met Akhundzada in the southwestern Afghan city of Kandahar in June, the first such publicly known meeting between the supreme leader and the foreign official. So it sounds like they consider themselves to be a recognized government, regardless of how we view them. So there's that. They are not quite as gullible when it comes to negotiating. Maybe gullible is the wrong word. They may not be as willing to negotiate, to play along with our silly little games. Unfortunately for the women and girls over there, of course. Even though the Taliban are officially isolated on the global stage, they appear to have enough interactions and engagement with all the wrong countries for ties with countries in or to inch toward normalization, whatever that means. Cooperation with the Taliban on narcotics, refugees, and counterterrorism is of international interest. In other words, interest globally, including to the West. Countries like China, Russia, and neighboring Pakistan want an end to sanctions. Well, we don't really want them all working together now, do we? The political interactions are such that no country in the region is thinking of bringing Afghanistan under their power or control, said Zaif. He said the Taliban's foreign outreach is hampered by blacklists preventing officials from traveling and by lacking common ground with the rest of the world. What opposition is there to the Taliban? And this is the last section. There's no armed or political opposition with enough domestic or foreign support to topple the Taliban. Fun phrase. Toppling the Taliban. A fighting force resisting Taliban rule from the Panjshir valley north of Kabul is being violently purged. Public protests are rare. That is true. We don't hear about protests over there, even though they have plenty to protest. The Islamic State has struck high-profile targets in deadly bombings, including 2 government ministries, but the militants lack fighters, money, and other resources to wage a major offensive against the Taliban. There's the end of the article. Thin. But let me begin with this. Okay, monologue. My rhyme.
Hello, and welcome back to my humble show. This is just a little rhyme I wrote in honor of the Gold Star families who testified in the Congressional Forum just over a week ago in regards to the botched withdrawal from Afghanistan. Also, yesterday marked the 2-year anniversary since the fall of Kabul. You already know what time it is, so don't check your watch like Joe Biden did. 13 soldiers in coffins, and he lied about it over closed lids. If they each were named Brittany Griner, he'd have their families dining at his crib. Instead, he droned an innocent family, blamed a general, and claimed to win. He blamed the last guy for the failure, then called it success in the end. That was just another new low, but the narrative is the one you spin. When he said the buck stops with him, he must have meant the money coming from his kid. No wonder Hunter makes excuses like father, like son. Grown men. Sleepy Joe was on vacation as the Taliban was taking over land. That was just the beginning of the botched withdrawal from Afghanistan. Some parents are still asking questions, but I guess the message is phone a friend. He was clumsy at every step, but thinks we'll believe he didn't stumble in. Between Bagram and Kabul, our military was bottled, throttled in. They were in hell with bad intel and a loose terrorist to pull the pin. After Afghans fell from wheel wells, our president thought he'd play pretend, knocking on wood like no one's being killed right now. Well, think again. 2 years later, there's still no accountability or making amends. The least he could do was try not to offend those who died to defend.
These are the names. Okay, I can stop it there. Let me pull up an article with those same names listed. I'll read through them, and then I'll wrap this show up. Here are the names of the 13 U.S. service members killed in Afghanistan attack. And yes, I would highly recommend you watching the congressional forum from less than 2 weeks ago, where several of the parents, I want to say 8 or so, testified. Yeah. Not a lot of recognition from the Biden administration, I'll say that much. And they called him and the rest of his administration out. Okay, so reading through this quickly. A Thursday attack outside the Hamid Karzai International Airport, Kabul, Afghanistan, killed 13 U.S. service members supporting Operation Freedom's Sentinel. 11 Marines, 1 Navy corpsman, and 1 soldier were killed as the result of an enemy attack while supporting non-combatant evacuation operations, according to a Saturday press release from the Department of Defense, which released the names of the U.S. troops. The names were released 24 hours after families of the deceased were notified. For the Marine Corps, the deceased are, and I don't know how much of this I want to read. How much is there to read? You know, I'll just read their names and leave it at that. I might save the rest of this for another show, where I can send you the link to the article if you want to read about them yourself. Like I said, some of their parents were at this recent congressional forum speaking on their behalf. The rest of them, I'm not really sure how they feel about it all, but I do remember some of them who were not in the congressional forum speaking out against all that had happened 2 years ago when the tragedy first happened. Okay, so Johanny Rosario Picardo, 25. Nicole L.G., 23. Darren T. Hoover, 31. Hunter Lopez, 22. Dagan W. Page, 23. Humberto A. Sanchez, 22. David L. Espinoza, 20. Jared M. Schmitz, 20. Riley J. McCullum, 20. Dylan R. Marola, 20. Kareem M. Nikui, Maxton W. Soviak, 22. And lastly, Ryan C. Knaus, 23. And if I skipped over anyone, my apologies. This is an article from the Marine Corps Times.com, that is. You can find it for yourself. It is from August 28 of 2021. But as relevant as ever. especially since there are so many questions left to answer and so few in power willing to answer. But that's the end of my show. I gotta go. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Keep in touch. Keep in tune. New content is coming soon. Peace.